A black pilot is blocked from entering his own plane by someone who refuses to believe he belongs in the cockpit. Passengers watch, phones recording, as he's humiliated in front of his own crew. But just 3 minutes later, everything flips. The flight is grounded, panic sets in, and the only person who can save them is the very man they tried to keep out. What happens next will leave everyone speechless, including the one who stopped him. How does justice take flight at 39,000 feet? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Through the bustling corridors of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the evening crowd moved in waves of hurried footsteps and rolling suitcases. At 6:45 p.m., the warm Georgia sunset painted golden stripes across the employee lounge's windows, creating a peaceful contrast to the controlled chaos outside. Captain Elijah Moore sat in his usual corner spot, his crisp Navy uniform a testament to decades of attention to detail. Every crease was perfect. Every brass button gleamed. His coffee, black, no sugar, sent wisps of steam into the air as he carefully reviewed the flight manifest for his overnight to Zurich. The manifest lay flat on the break room table next to his worn leather flight logbook. As he double-checked the passenger count, his eyes drifted to a photo tucked carefully in the logbook's front pocket. His daughter Maya smiled back at him, her graduation cap slightly crooked, her eyes bright with promise. The corner of his mouth lifted in a small, proud smile. "Looking good for tonight," he murmured to himself, scanning the weather report on his tablet. Clear skies all the way across the Atlantic, with only a slight chance of turbulence near the Irish coast, just the way he liked it. The familiar weight of responsibility settled comfortably on his shoulders as he gathered his materials. 15 years of commercial flights had taught him that preparation was everything. He'd earned every minute of those years, every mile in the sky, though some had tried to convince him otherwise. As Elijah made his way through the terminal, his steady stride and commanding presence drew respectful nods from the airport staff. "Evening, Captain Moore," called out Sandra from the coffee shop, waving as he passed. 2 gate agents smiled and greeted him by name, and he returned their warmth with a genuine smile of his own. Near gate B18, he noticed Mr. Johnson, one of the elderly janitors, jabbing frustrated fingers at a vending machine. The old man's face was creased with worry as he stared at the dollar bill that kept getting rejected. "Let me help you with that, Mr. Johnson," Elijah said, pausing his walk to the gate. He pulled out his own dollar bill and smoothed it carefully against the edge of the machine before feeding it in. The vending machine hummed happily this time, accepting the payment. "Bless you, Captain," Mr. Johnson said, his weathered face breaking into a grateful smile. "These new machines, they don't like us old-timers much." "They just need a gentle touch," Elijah replied warmly, waiting until Mr. Johnson had his snack before continuing on his way. Gate B22 was relatively quiet when he arrived, 30 minutes ahead of schedule as usual. The late evening flight to Zurich typically attracted business travelers, and they hadn't started gathering yet. Elijah liked these moments before the rush, using them to mentally prepare for the long night ahead. He was just about to head down the jet bridge when a figure stepped directly into his path. The young ground marshal couldn't have been more than 25, his uniform still stiff with newness. The name tag read Carter, and everything about his posture screamed discomfort and uncertainty. Carter's eyes moved from Elijah's face to his uniform and back again, his expression hardening with each pass. His hand tightened on his clipboard as he shifted his weight, placing himself more firmly in Elijah's way. "This area is restricted," Carter announced, his voice carrying a sharp edge that drew curious glances from nearby passengers. "Pilots only." Elijah kept his expression neutral, though confusion flickered briefly across his features. He'd walked this same path countless times, greeted by countless faces, but this was new. His hand moved calmly toward his flight bag. "I understand," Elijah replied evenly, reaching for his ID. "I'm Captain Moore. I'm flying tonight's—" Carter's eyes narrowed, cutting him off. "I'm going to need to see some identification." The young marshal's tone suggested he'd already decided what he was looking at, regardless of what any ID might show. Elijah slowly withdrew his pilot's credentials, holding them steady in the space between them. The plastic caught the fluorescent lighting, clearly displaying his photo, rank, and credentials. Yet Carter's expression didn't shift. If anything, his frown deepened as he studied the ID with exaggerated scrutiny. The air around them grew thick with tension. A few passengers waiting at the gate had stopped their conversations, their attention drawn to the unfolding scene. Some looked uncomfortable, others confused, and a few seemed to understand exactly what was happening. Elijah stood perfectly still, his calm exterior masking the familiar weight of this moment. He'd been here before, different faces, different places, but always the same dance. His daughter's smile flashed in his mind, reminding him of all the conversations they'd had about moments just like this. Carter turned the ID card over, then over again, his skepticism evident in every movement. "This area is for authorized personnel only," he repeated, as if the credentials in his hands weren't real enough, clear enough, professional enough. Carter held out his hand expectantly, and Elijah carefully removed his credentials from his flight bag. The leather of his wallet was soft and worn from years of use as he extracted his pilot's license and airport security badge. His airline-issued tablet displayed his flight manifest and crew assignment in crisp detail. Each item was meticulously maintained, just like everything else in his professional life. "Here you are," Elijah said, his voice steady and professional. He'd been through similar situations before, though usually not quite this blatant. The credentials were all clearly visible in the bright airport lighting, each bearing his name and photograph, Captain Elijah Moore. Carter took the documents with stiff fingers, holding them as if they might bite. His eyes darted between the photos and Elijah's face, his brow furrowed in exaggerated concentration. The young marshal turned each credential over, examining watermarks and holograms with unnecessary thoroughness. "These seem—" Carter paused, his hand hovering near the radio clipped to his safety vest. His uncertainty was evident in the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot, but his expression remained hard. "These need to be verified." Elijah maintained his composed stance, though he felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Behind him, he could hear the rustle of movement as passengers began to take notice of the situation. The gate area had grown quieter, the usual pre-boarding chatter dying down as people turned their attention to the scene unfolding before them. Carter's fingers found his radio, and he pressed the button with perhaps more force than necessary. "This is Ground Marshal Carter at Gate B-22. I need TSA assistance to verify some documentation." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying his nervousness despite his attempt at authority. The radio crackled with acknowledgement, and within minutes, 2 TSA officers approached from different directions. The first to arrive was Officer Thompson, a veteran of the airport security team. His face lit up with recognition as he spotted Elijah. "Captain Moore," Thompson called out, his friendly tone contrasting sharply with the tense atmosphere. "Didn't know you were on tonight's Zurich run. How's Madison doing in flight school?" Before Elijah could respond, the second TSA officer, whose name tag read Martinez, stepped forward, positioning himself slightly behind Carter. Martinez's expression mirrored Carter's skepticism, his hand resting casually but purposefully on his belt. "What seems to be the problem here?" Martinez asked, directing his question to Carter rather than Elijah. The gathering crowd of passengers had grown larger, their faces pressed against the terminal's glass walls. Some held phones, and Elijah noticed a teenage boy near the window deliberately holding his device at chest level, recording the entire interaction. The boy's expression was a mix of concern and determination. Carter handed the credentials to Martinez, who began his own examination. "These documents need authentication," Carter said, his voice stronger now with the backup of another authority figure. "Protocol requires thorough verification for restricted areas." Officer Thompson stepped closer, peering at the documents in Martinez's hands. "These are legitimate," Thompson said firmly. "I've known Captain Moore for years. He's one of our most experienced pilots." Martinez continued his inspection, seemingly unmoved by his colleague's vouching. The crowd behind the glass had grown larger, their whispers becoming more audible. Some passengers scheduled for the Zurich flight checked their watches nervously. while others shook their heads in obvious disapproval of the situation. The teenage boy's phone continued recording, capturing every moment of the tense scene. Through its microphone, it picked up a clear voice from the crowd. An older woman with silver hair and expensive jewelry, speaking just loud enough to be heard, probably stole that uniform. The comment hung in the air like smoke, heavy and acrid. Elijah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his professional demeanor. He'd learned long ago that dignity was his best defense. Officer Thompson's face darkened at the woman's words. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Elijah and the growing crowd. "I've personally verified Captain Moore's credentials hundreds of times," he announced loudly, his voice carrying authority that made both Carter and Martinez look up. "He's been flying out of this airport for 15 years. I can assure you these documents are legitimate." Martinez slowly lowered the credentials, glancing between Thompson and Carter. The weight of Thompson's words and his obvious familiarity with Elijah seemed to finally penetrate their wall of suspicion. Carter's face had grown slightly red, whether from embarrassment or frustration wasn't clear. He shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his safety vest as if the yellow stripes might offer some guidance. Finally, with visible reluctance, he stepped aside from the jet bridge entrance. Elijah gathered his credentials with the same calm precision he'd shown throughout the entire encounter. His watch now showed he was 15 minutes behind schedule, a delay that would need to be accounted for in his pre-flight preparations. Without a word to Carter, he moved past the young marshal and entered the jet bridge, his footsteps steady and purposeful. The automatic door hissed shut behind him, leaving Carter standing awkwardly between the two TSA officers. Through the glass, passengers could see Elijah's straight-backed figure walking toward the aircraft, his dignity intact despite the humiliation he'd just endured. The teenage boy finally lowered his phone, but the recording had already captured everything, from Carter's initial confrontation to Thompson's decisive intervention, and most importantly, Elijah's unwavering professionalism throughout the entire ordeal. Inside the aircraft, the familiar smell of recycled air and fresh coffee greeted Elijah as he made his way through the cabin. The flight attendants' faces lit up with genuine warmth at his arrival. Sarah, the lead attendant who had flown with him countless times, stepped forward with a bright smile. "Evening, Captain Moore. Good to have you back," she said, straightening her navy blue scarf. "We missed you on the Geneva route last week." "Thank you, Sarah," Elijah replied, his voice carrying its usual steady tone despite the lingering tension in his jaw. "How's the cabin prep coming along?" "Right on schedule, Captain, just finishing the galley inventory now." Elijah nodded, appreciating the efficiency he'd come to expect from Sarah's team. As he moved toward the cockpit, other crew members offered their greetings, each interaction marked by the kind of respect earned through years of consistent leadership. In the cockpit, Elijah settled into the familiar leather of the captain's seat. His hands moved automatically to the overhead panels, fingers dancing across switches and dials with practiced precision. The radio crackled to life as he checked in with flight operations. "Operations, this is Captain Moore on Flight 237 to Zurich." "Good evening, Captain," came the prompt response. "We've got you cleared for departure at 21:15 hours. Fuel load confirmed at 95,000 pounds. "Copy that," Elijah acknowledged, making a note in his flight log. He began working through the pre-flight checklist, each item receiving his full attention. The methodical process helped settle his mind, pushing aside the unpleasant encounter at the jet bridge. The cockpit lights cast a soft glow over the instrument panel as Elijah verified each system. He checked the weather radar, noting a small storm system they'd need to navigate around over the Atlantic. His movements were deliberate and focused, though the muscles in his jaw remained tight, the only visible sign of his earlier confrontation. The sound of footsteps in the cockpit entrance drew his attention. First Officer Leland appeared, his uniform crisp and new, his enthusiasm evident in his eager expression. The young officer's hands clutched his flight bag tightly, betraying his nervousness. "Good evening, Captain Moore," Leland said, settling into the right seat. He arranged his materials with careful attention, clearly trying to mirror Elijah's organized approach. "Sorry if I'm a bit late. Though actually it's funny. Some guy just waved me through without even checking my ID. Didn't even look at my credentials. Elijah's hands paused briefly over the instrument panel. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him, but he simply gave a small nod and returned to his checklist. "Let's run through the systems check together, First Officer." Leland straightened in his seat, clearly appreciating the opportunity to learn from Elijah's experience. "Yes, sir. Ready when you are." Together, they began working through the pre-flight procedures. Elijah's voice remained steady and patient as he guided Leland through each step, explaining the importance of thorough verification and sharing insights gained from his years of experience. "Always double-check the fuel calculations," Elijah advised, pointing to the relevant display. "Even when the ground crew confirms, it's our responsibility to verify." Leland nodded eagerly, scribbling notes in his small notebook. His initial nervousness began to fade as they worked, replaced by focused attention to each task. The cockpit settled into a rhythm of professional efficiency, punctuated by clear communication between the two pilots. They were nearly finished with their preparations, about to call for pushback, when Leland's breathing suddenly changed. Elijah noticed the sharp intake of air and glanced over to see his first officer's face contorted in pain. "Leland?" Elijah asked, immediately alert to the change. The young officer's hand flew to his chest, his fingers clutching at his uniform. His face had gone pale, and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. Before Elijah could say another word, Leland's eyes rolled back and he slumped forward in his seat. Elijah's training kicked in instantly. In one fluid motion, he reached for the crew intercom while simultaneously checking Leland's pulse at his neck. "This is the captain." His voice rang out clear and authoritative through the aircraft's speaker system. "Medical emergency in the cockpit. I need immediate medical assistance and paramedics to the aircraft." Sarah's voice came back immediately. "Copy that, Captain. Emergency services are being notified." Elijah carefully adjusted Leland's position, ensuring his airway remained clear. The young officer's pulse was rapid but present, his breathing shallow. Years of emergency training guided Elijah's actions as he monitored his first officer's vital signs while maintaining awareness of their surrounding environment. The sound of running footsteps echoed through the cabin. Within minutes, 2 paramedics burst into the cockpit, their equipment ready. They moved with practiced efficiency, quickly assessing Leland's condition. "What happened?" the first paramedic asked, attaching monitoring equipment to Leland's chest. "He complained of chest pain and lost consciousness," Elijah reported, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "It happened suddenly, about 30 seconds before I called for assistance." The paramedics worked quickly, their movements precise and coordinated. The narrow confines of the cockpit made their task challenging, but they managed with professional skill. Leland remained unconscious as they transferred him to a portable stretcher, his young face pale under the cockpit lights. As they prepared to move Leland out of the cockpit, Elijah reached out and briefly squeezed his first officer's shoulder. The gesture was quick, but carried the weight of genuine concern. He watched as the paramedics carefully maneuvered the stretcher through the cockpit door, their actions swift but gentle. The paramedics worked swiftly, their movements precise as they secured Leland to the stretcher. The narrow aisle of the aircraft became a corridor of urgent activity as they guided their patient toward the exit. Sarah, her face etched with concern, approached Elijah as the medical team passed by. "Captain," she said in a hushed tone, leaning close. "I was monitoring his vitals while we waited for the paramedics. His pulse dropped dangerously low at one point." Her experienced eyes reflected genuine worry. "I've never seen someone crash so suddenly." Elijah absorbed this information with his characteristic composure, though his concern deepened. The cabin had erupted into a low buzz of worried conversations, passengers craning their necks to catch glimpses of the unfolding drama. Some held their phones up, but the flight attendants professionally directed them to lower their devices. Taking a deep breath, Elijah reached for the cabin intercom. His finger pressed the familiar button, and his steady voice filled the aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Moore speaking. We are experiencing a slight delay due to a medical situation with one of our crew members. I want to assure you that they are receiving the best possible care. We appreciate your patience and understanding as we work to resolve this situation. I will keep you updated as more information becomes available." His words, measured and professional, seemed to settle some of the nervous energy in the cabin. Several passengers nodded appreciatively at his transparency, while others returned to their seats, accepting the delay with relative calm. Sarah coordinated with the rest of the cabin crew, ensuring passengers remained comfortable and informed. The methodical routine of airline service continued around the emergency, a testament to their training and professionalism. In the operations center, controllers and schedulers worked frantically to address the sudden crew shortage. Phone calls bounced between different departments, searching for a solution. The scheduling supervisor, her computer screen filled with crew rotation charts, shook her head in frustration. "We need a relief pilot rated for the A330 for transatlantic operations," she explained to her team. "Current position shows nobody within reasonable range." Her fingers flew across the keyboard, checking and rechecking available options. "Nearest qualified pilot is in Chicago, minimum 3 hours out." Messages flew back and forth between operations and the aircraft. Elijah received each update in the cockpit, where he had chosen to remain while awaiting further instructions. The familiar environment of switches, dials, and displays provided a sense of order amid the chaos. "Operations, this is Captain Moore," he radioed. "I'll maintain position in the cockpit pending your guidance. Please keep me informed of any developments regarding First Officer Leland's condition." The response crackled back. "Copy that, Captain. We're still working on crew solutions. Flight status being updated to indefinite delay. Stand by for further instructions." Elijah glanced at the empty first officer's seat beside him, the events of the past hour feeling somehow surreal. His logbook lay open on his knee, the photo of his daughter still visible in its pages. Outside the cockpit windows, the evening sky had deepened to a rich purple, the airport lights beginning to twinkle against the growing darkness. Meanwhile, in the terminal, the teenage passenger who had witnessed the earlier confrontation at the jet bridge sat with his phone, fingers moving quickly across the screen. The video he had captured showed the entire interaction in sharp detail: Carter's suspicious stance, the unnecessary document checks, the elderly woman's prejudiced comment, and Elijah's dignified composure throughout the ordeal. With a few taps, he uploaded the clip to social media. His caption read simply, "He's the captain, you fool." The post went live, immediately gathering views and shares. Comments began appearing within seconds. "This is disgusting. That captain handled it like a pro, though. Share this everywhere. That guard needs to be fired. Look how calm the pilot stayed, true professional." The video began its journey through the digital landscape, each share adding to its momentum, each view bringing more attention to the incident that had unfolded at Gate B-22. In a small staff office near the terminal, Carter sat alone, his posture rigid in the uncomfortable chair. The computer screen before him displayed the flight information board, where Flight 237 to Zurich now showed "delayed crew issues" in bold letters. His eyes remained fixed on those words, their meaning carrying more weight than the simple status update suggested. The office felt unusually quiet, with only the hum of fluorescent lights and distant airport announcements breaking the silence. Carter's radio sat silent on the desk, its earlier calls for TSA verification now seeming like a distant memory. His hands rested motionless on the desk, his earlier certainty replaced by a growing sense of unease. The same flight status board that held his attention was being photographed by passengers throughout the terminal, each image potentially adding context to the video that was, at that very moment, beginning its viral spread across social media platforms. Carter remained unaware of the digital storm brewing, but something in his rigid posture suggested he already knew that consequences were inevitable. The office clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking time as the evening's events continued to unfold. Through the office window, Carter could see passengers from Flight 237 being redirected back to the terminal, their disappointed faces a direct result of the chain of events that had begun with his actions at the jet bridge. Meanwhile, the soft glow of instrument panels cast a gentle blue light across the cockpit as Elijah sat in his captain's seat, his tablet balanced on his knee. The cabin behind him had settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the occasional murmur of conversation and the rustle of snack wrappers. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, offering comfort items to passengers who had already waited hours beyond their scheduled departure. Elijah's fingers moved methodically across his tablet screen as he checked his emails, his expression remaining neutral despite the growing complications of the evening. A new message from corporate caught his attention, something about social media response protocols. But before he could open it, footsteps approached the cockpit door. The heavy door swung open, revealing Kenneth Barnes, the senior flight operations officer, his silver-streaked hair and crisp uniform reflecting his decades of experience. Behind him, partially hidden in the shadows of the dimmed cabin lights, stood Carter. The young ground marshal's shoulders were tensed, his gaze fixed firmly on the floor, avoiding any possibility of eye contact with the captain. "Captain Moore," Kenneth said, his voice carrying the weight of authority tempered by respect. "May we have a word?" Elijah gestured to the empty first officer's seat, setting his tablet aside. Kenneth stepped in, but Carter remained hovering uncertainly at the threshold until Kenneth motioned him inside. The young man moved stiffly to stand against the rear wall of the cockpit, his discomfort evident in every rigid movement. Through the cockpit door, Sarah appeared briefly. "We've distributed snacks and beverages to everyone," she reported quietly. "Most passengers are being understanding, but there's definitely some restlessness setting in." Kenneth nodded, waiting until Sarah had closed the door before speaking. "Captain, we've got ourselves a situation here." He pulled out his own tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be a series of messages. "We've checked every possible option within a 200-mile radius. No certified co-pilots available for immediate deployment. The nearest qualified relief pilot is still 3 hours out, minimum." Elijah absorbed this information silently, his experienced eyes taking in the subtle signs of stress in Kenneth's posture. Behind them, Carter shifted uncomfortably, the sound of his movement barely audible over the ambient hum of the aircraft's systems. "There's more," Kenneth continued, his voice lowering slightly. "That video from earlier, the incident at the gate, it's gone viral. Corporate is in full damage control mode. They're worried about the optics of this delay coming right after—" He trailed off, glancing briefly at Carter. The young ground marshal's face flushed red in the dim light, but he remained silent, his eyes still studying the cockpit floor with intense focus. Kenneth straightened in his seat, his expression becoming more formal. "Captain Moore, given your experience level and the special circumstances we're facing, we have authorization to proceed with a solo flight under ground support protocols. It's not ideal, but it's legal under these conditions." He paused, letting the words settle in the confined space of the cockpit. "The question is, are you willing to take full command?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Elijah's gaze moved thoughtfully across the instrument panel before him, taking in the familiar array of controls and displays that had been his professional home for 15 years. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and clear. "I'll do it," he said, then added, "but I have one condition." Kenneth leaned forward slightly, his eyebrows raising in question. Elijah turned in his seat, looking directly at Carter for the first time since he'd entered the cockpit. "He rides in the jump seat. Full flight." Carter's head snapped up, his face draining of color. Kenneth blinked rapidly, glancing between the two men. "Captain, I'm not sure that's—" Kenneth began, but Elijah cut him off with a gentle shake of his head. "Let him see what we really do," Elijah said simply, his voice carrying no trace of anger or resentment, just quiet determination. "Let him understand exactly what he was trying to keep me from doing tonight." The cockpit fell silent except for the soft beeping of various instruments. Kenneth looked thoughtful, his years of experience allowing him to recognize the opportunity being presented. This wasn't about punishment, it was about education. After what seemed like an eternity, Kenneth nodded slowly. "I'll need to clear it with security, but I don't see any regulatory issues." He turned to Carter, who stood frozen against the wall. "Ground Marshal Carter, you're being formally notified. Captain Moore has requested your presence in the jump seat for the duration of this flight to Zurich. Do you understand?" Carter swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in the dim light. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but clear enough to hear. "Yes, sir." The words carried no resistance, no argument, just simple acceptance. His eyes finally met Elijah's, and for a brief moment, something passed between them, not quite understanding yet, but perhaps the beginning of it. Kenneth stood, smoothing his uniform with practiced hands. "I'll make the necessary arrangements and notify corporate of the solution." He paused at the cockpit door, looking back at Elijah. "Captain, we'll begin preparations for departure within the hour." As Kenneth's footsteps faded down the aisle, Elijah turned back to his instrument checks, his movements as precise and professional as always. Carter remained standing against the wall. His world shifted dramatically from what it had been just hours ago when he'd stood blocking that same captain's path at the jet bridge. The cabin door sealed with a pressurized hiss, marking the point of no return. At 9:50 p.m., the familiar sounds of final preparations echoed through the aircraft. Overhead bins clicking shut, seatbelts fastening, and the gentle murmur of passengers settling in for their transatlantic journey. Carter stood at the cockpit entrance, his uniform crisp, but his composure anything but. His fingers traced the edge of his badge, a nervous habit he'd developed during his first week on the job. The jump seat behind Captain Moore looked both inviting and intimidating, a front row seat to what promised to be a very long night. "Take your seat, Marshal Carter," Elijah said without turning around, his voice carrying the same professional tone he'd maintained throughout the evening. "Safety harness needs to be secured before we begin taxi." Carter moved mechanically, lowering himself into the jump seat. The harness proved more complicated than expected, with straps that seemed to go in multiple directions. His fingers fumbled with the buckles until a quiet click finally indicated success. Through the cockpit windows, the terminal lights cast long shadows across the tarmac. Ground crew members moved with practiced efficiency, their reflective vests catching the glow of runway lights. Inside the cabin, snippets of conversation drifted forward. "That's him. From the video. Can't believe they treated him like that. Best pilot in the fleet, I heard." Sarah, the lead flight attendant, appeared in the cockpit doorway. Her experienced eyes took in the unusual scene: the empty first officer's seat, Carter perched awkwardly in the jump seat, and Elijah's steady presence in the captain's chair. "Cabin secured, Captain," she reported professionally, though her warm smile was directed solely at Elijah. All passengers seated and briefed on the situation. "Thank you, Sarah," Elijah responded, his fingers dancing across the overhead panel with practiced precision. "Please take your jump seat for departure." As Sarah disappeared, Elijah began his pre-departure checklist. His voice filled the cockpit with a steady rhythm of commands and confirmations. Flight controls, check. Fuel quantity, 42,000 kilograms verified. Hydraulic systems, all three showing green. Carter watched, initially trying to maintain his professional distance, but soon finding himself drawn into the complexity of the operation. Each switch, each button, each display seemed to hold vital importance. Elijah's hands moved with the confidence of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times, yet he approached each check with unwavering attention. "IRS alignment complete," Elijah announced, tapping a screen showing various navigation data. "FMS route verified against flight plan." He paused, glancing at a digital checklist. "TCAS system, testing." The radio crackled to life. "Atlas 2476 ground control. You're cleared to push back from gate Bravo 22. Taxi to runway 27R via taxiway Charlie. Hold short of Alpha." "Atlas 2476 cleared to push, taxi 27R via Charlie, hold short Alpha," Elijah repeated flawlessly. His right hand reached up, flicking several switches in quick succession. "APU running. Engine start sequence initiated." Carter felt the subtle vibration as the massive engines began their startup sequence. The whine of turbines grew steadily, transforming from a whisper to a confident roar. Through the cockpit windows, he could see the terminal slowly receding as the pushback tug guided them backward. "Notice how the N1 gauge climbs gradually," Elijah explained, not as if speaking to Carter specifically, but as though giving a lecture to an unseen classroom. "We're looking for a stable reading above 23% before introducing fuel." The aircraft's movements were deliberate and precise as they taxied toward the runway. Elijah maintained constant communication with ground control, acknowledging each instruction with perfect radio etiquette. The complexity of airport operations became apparent as they navigated the maze of taxiways, other aircraft, and ground vehicles. When they reached the holding point for runway 27R, Elijah performed another series of checks. Before takeoff checklist, he announced, flight controls, checked and free. Flaps, set for takeoff. Trim set. Anti-ice not required. Transponder set mode Charlie. The radio crackled again. Atlas 2476, wind 270 at 8, runway 27R, cleared for takeoff. Atlas 2476 cleared for takeoff 27R, Elijah confirmed. He advanced the throttles smoothly, and the engines responded with increased power. The massive aircraft began rolling down the runway, gathering speed with impressive authority. Carter's hands gripped the edges of his seat as the ground lights blurred past with increasing speed. The nose lifted gradually, and suddenly they were airborne, the lights of Atlanta spreading out below them like a glittering carpet. Positive rate, Elijah called out, his voice steady. Gear up. The landing gear retracted with a subtle thump, and the aircraft continued its climb into the night sky. They encountered some mild turbulence as they passed through a layer of clouds, causing the aircraft to shudder slightly. Carter's grip on his seat tightened, but Elijah remained perfectly composed, making minor adjustments to their heading and power settings without any sign of concern. Through the cockpit windows, stars began to appear as they climbed above the cloud layer. Their brightness seemed to mirror the tension in the small cockpit, distant, cold, yet somehow intense. The city lights below gradually became more distant, transforming into a tapestry of twinkling points that rivaled the stars above. Elijah continued to work through his procedures methodically, each action accompanied by a clear explanation. Passing through 10,000 feet, he announced. Beginning acceleration. Flaps up. Autopilot engaged. His hands moved with precision, adjusting various controls as the aircraft settled into its climb. Carter watched all of this in silence, his earlier rigid demeanor slowly giving way to something closer to awe. The complexity of the operation, the responsibility involved, and the sheer skill required to manage it all began to sink in. Each procedure Elijah performed seemed to carry the weight of years of experience, each decision backed by countless hours in the air. The stars continued to shine through the cockpit windows as they climbed higher into the night sky, their light a silent witness to the unfolding lesson in both aviation and humanity taking place in the confined space of the cockpit. Sometime later, the digital clock on the instrument panel showed 10:50 p.m. as Atlas Flight 2476 cruised steadily at 39,000 feet. The vast darkness outside was broken only by distant stars and the occasional flash of the aircraft's navigation lights, reflecting off wispy clouds. Inside the cockpit, the gentle hum of the engines provided a constant backdrop to the array of softly glowing instruments. Elijah's hands moved with practiced efficiency across the controls, performing routine systems checks. The autopilot maintained their course, allowing him to monitor the aircraft's performance with measured attention. The cabin lights had been dimmed for the overnight flight, casting the cockpit in a peaceful blue glow from the instrument displays. Carter sat quietly in the jump seat, his earlier stiffness somewhat softened by exhaustion and the hypnotic drone of the engines. His eyes followed Elijah's movements, noting how each action seemed purposeful and precise. The complexity of the cockpit that had initially overwhelmed him now sparked a genuine curiosity. He found himself leaning forward slightly whenever Elijah adjusted a setting or checked a reading, trying to understand the purpose behind each action. Fuel consumption nominal, Elijah announced to no one in particular, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. Weather radar shows clear skies ahead. His fingers tapped a few buttons on the overhead panel, confirming various system statuses. The routine checks complete, Elijah settled back in his seat. His reflection in the darkened windscreen showed a face both focused and contemplative. After a few moments, he spoke again, his voice carrying a different weight than his previous technical announcements. "My first solo flight was in a Cessna 152, he said. eyes still forward. Small, single-engine, perfect trainer aircraft. I'd saved for 3 years working 2 jobs to afford those lessons. He paused, adjusting the air conditioning flow. The instructor who signed me off asked me 3 times if I was sure I was ready. He'd never done that with any other student. Carter shifted in his seat, the harness creaking slightly. Elijah continued, his voice steady and measured. When I started applying to commercial airlines, I had 3,500 flight hours. Most pilots got interviews at 1,500. I kept hearing not enough experience until I hit 5,000. His hand reached up to adjust a radio frequency. Found out later some of my colleagues got in with 1,200 hours. Good pilots, all of them. Just didn't look like me. The cockpit fell silent again, save for the constant hum of the engines. Through the windows, the moon had emerged from behind a cloud, casting a silver glow across the aircraft's wing. First year as a commercial pilot, I was mistaken for ground crew 17 times, baggage handler 23 times. Once, a passenger refused to board because they saw me doing the pre-flight walk-around and assumed I was a maintenance worker who'd stolen a uniform. Elijah's voice remained calm, but carried decades of accumulated weight. After a while, you start wearing your credentials on the outside of your jacket. Keep your ID visible at all times. Show up extra early to every flight just in case someone questions your presence. He reached for his water bottle, took a small sip. You know what's funny? The actual flying part, that's always been the easy part. Physics doesn't care what you look like. The sky doesn't ask for extra credentials. His fingers drummed lightly on the control yoke. It's everything else that wears you down. The constant proving, the extra scrutiny, the subtle doubts. Carter's breathing had grown shallow, his earlier exhaustion replaced by an uncomfortable awareness. Elijah continued his story, each word measured and clear. Had a colleague, brilliant pilot, flew F-16s in the Air Force before joining commercial aviation. Left the industry after 3 years. Said he was tired of being the example. Tired of having to be twice as good just to be seen as equal. Elijah checked a gauge, made a minor adjustment. He's selling real estate now. Happier, he says. Doesn't miss the sideways looks, the whispered comments, the constant need to prove himself. The aircraft encountered a pocket of light turbulence causing a slight tremor. Elijah's hand moved automatically to adjust the thrust, smoothing out their path through the disturbed air. My daughter wants to be a pilot, he said, his voice softening slightly. She's 12, already knows more about aircraft systems than most adults. But every time she mentions it, her mother gets this look. Not disapproval, just concern, because she knows what her daughter will face. The barriers that shouldn't exist but do. The fights that shouldn't be necessary but are. He paused, checking another system reading before continuing. You know what the worst part is? It's not the obvious stuff. Not the clear discrimination or the outright prejudice. Those you can fight. It's the 1,000 tiny cuts, the extra questions, the double checks, the subtle assumptions, the way you have to prove yourself over and over, flight after flight, year after year. The moonlight caught Elijah's captain's stripes as he adjusted his position in his seat. Most pilots of color I know who left the industry, they didn't leave because they couldn't handle the flying. They left because they got tired of handling everything else, tired of being the first or the only in their crew, tired of representing their entire race every time they step into a cockpit. Carter's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. I didn't know. Elijah kept his eyes forward, his expression unchanged. That's the point. You never had to. The moment hung in the air, heavy with unspoken understanding. Then, breaking through the tension, a soft electronic chime sounded from the instrument panel. A small yellow light began flashing on the overhead display. Without missing a beat, Elijah's hands moved to the appropriate controls, his voice returning to its professional tone as he began addressing the warning indicator. The transition from storyteller to captain was seamless, his movements calm and practiced as he started the troubleshooting sequence. The Atlantic stretched beneath them like a vast black mirror, reflecting nothing but darkness at this hour. The first hint of trouble came as a subtle vibration through the airframe. a sensation Elijah recognized instantly from thousands of hours in the cockpit. His hands instinctively moved to the controls before the aircraft even began to shake in earnest. The turbulence hit suddenly, causing the massive aircraft to shudder. Carter's fingers clamped down on his armrests, his knuckles turning white as the plane bucked against the unstable air. Despite the violent motion, Elijah's movements remained precise and measured, his eyes scanning the instruments with practiced efficiency. Reaching for the cabin intercom, Elijah's voice came through clear and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've entered an area of turbulent air. I'll be turning on the fasten seatbelt sign, and I ask that all passengers and crew return to their seats immediately. This should pass in a few minutes. Thank you for your patience." The plane lurched again, eliciting a sharp intake of breath from Carter. Elijah's hands moved smoothly across the controls, making minor adjustments to their heading and altitude. His eyes never stopped moving between the various instruments, reading the wind patterns and atmospheric data with the expertise of someone who had weathered countless similar situations. "Watch the vertical speed indicator," Elijah said calmly, pointing to one of the displays. "When you see this pattern, it usually means we're dealing with clear air turbulence. Best approach is to adjust altitude. Sometimes just 1,000 feet up or down can make all the difference." As if to demonstrate his point, he gently eased the aircraft higher, finding a pocket of calmer air. The shaking began to subside, though Carter's grip on the armrests remained tight. The younger man's face had taken on a slightly pale cast in the blue glow of the instrument panels. Just as the turbulence began to settle, a new warning light flickered to life on the navigation display. The yellow caution indicator was joined by a soft but insistent electronic tone. Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the readout. "Backup navigation display malfunction," he said, his voice maintaining its professional calm. "Non-critical, but we'll need to run through the override sequence." His fingers began moving across the controls with practiced precision, accessing deeper layers of the aircraft's systems. Carter leaned forward, his earlier fear forgotten in the face of this new development. He watched as Elijah pulled up a series of system diagnostics, each screen more complex than the last. The captain's movements were quick but deliberate, each keystroke and switch flip serving a specific purpose. "This is a Class B override procedure," Elijah explained, not pausing in his work. "It's part of the emergency protocols, but it's rarely needed. You have to execute the steps in exactly the right order." His fingers danced across the keypad, entering a complex sequence of commands. "First, we isolate the affected system." The warning tone continued its steady rhythm as Elijah worked. He walked Carter through each step of the process, explaining the reasoning behind every action. "Now we're going to force a hard reset of the backup nav computer. It's like rebooting your phone but with about 50 more safety checks built in." Carter watched, fascinated, as Elijah navigated through procedures that weren't covered in any basic training. The complexity of the override sequence was daunting, yet Elijah handled it with the same steady confidence he'd shown during the turbulence. "There's a specific timing to this next part," Elijah continued, his focus intense but controlled. "You have to input the reset command within 3 seconds of the system prompt, or it defaults back to the error state." His timing was perfect. The warning light blinked twice and then went dark. The plane continued its steady course through the now calm air, as Elijah ran a final series of checks to ensure the system was fully stabilized. The backup navigation display came back online, its screen showing normal readings across all parameters. Finally, Elijah allowed himself to lean back slightly in his seat, taking a deep breath. His movements had never betrayed any anxiety or uncertainty, but now there was a subtle release of tension in his shoulders. Carter stared at him, shaking his head in amazement. The young man's earlier rigid demeanor had been replaced by something approaching awe. "How the hell do you stay that calm?" he asked, his voice carrying both admiration and disbelief. For the first time since takeoff, Elijah turned to look directly at Carter. His eyes held 15 years of experience, countless challenges faced, and battles fought not just against mechanical issues, but against prejudice and doubt. "Because I've had to for 15 years every day." The words hung in the cockpit, heavy with meaning. The soft hum of the engines seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed, filling the space between the two men with its steady drone. The stars continued their silent watch through the cockpit windows as the aircraft cruised onward through the darkness, carrying its cargo of passengers, crew, and unspoken understanding. The digital clock on the instrument panel showed 11:50 p.m. as the aircraft cruised steadily across the Atlantic. The cockpit hummed with the familiar symphony of aviation, the low drone of engines, occasional radio crackles, and the soft beeping of monitoring systems. Through the windows, darkness stretched in every direction, broken only by the blinking navigation lights reflecting off the wing surfaces. Carter shifted in the jump seat, trying to find a more comfortable position. The initial terror of turbulence had faded, replaced by the monotony of long-distance flight. His eyes kept drifting to Elijah, who sat focused on his tablet, methodically reviewing the mid-flight performance metrics with unwavering attention to detail. The captain's fingers moved efficiently across the screen, logging data points and checking system statuses. Each movement spoke of years of experience, of countless nights spent ensuring everything was precisely as it should be. Carter watched as Elijah made a small notation about fuel consumption, then cross-referenced it against their flight plan. The radio crackled with routine communications from other aircraft sharing their Atlantic corridor. Elijah responded when needed, his voice carrying the same professional calm it had maintained throughout the flight. The exchange of coordinates and weather updates created a rhythmic backdrop to their silent vigil. Carter cleared his throat softly, his hands fidgeting in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice came out rougher than he intended, almost catching in his throat. "My father." He started, then paused, searching for words. "He flew Blackhawks, 20 years in the Army." Elijah continued his work but gave a small nod to show he was listening. The gesture encouraged Carter to continue, though his words still came haltingly. "He used to tell me." Carter's voice grew quieter, shame creeping into his tone. "He always said black pilots don't make it to command seats, that they weren't." He couldn't finish the sentence, the words sticking in his throat. Elijah's hands stilled on the tablet. He didn't look up immediately, instead taking a moment to absorb the weight of Carter's admission. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no anger, only a deep, worn knowledge. "Let me tell you about Captain Marcus Washington," Elijah said, setting the tablet aside. "He was my mentor when I first started flying commercially. 30 years of experience. Could land a 747 in his sleep. The kind of pilot everyone wanted to learn from." Carter listened intently as Elijah continued, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone. "Marcus taught me more than just flying. He taught me how to navigate the other parts of this job, the parts they don't cover in flight school." Elijah adjusted a dial slightly before continuing. "He showed me how to handle the jokes that weren't really jokes, the comments about how surprising it was to see someone like me in the cockpit, the way some passengers would do a double take when they saw who was flying their plane." The captain's words painted a picture of a reality Carter had never had to consider. Marcus was passed over for promotion 6 times, always with a different excuse. Too aggressive, too passive, not enough leadership qualities, despite training half the pilots in his fleet. Carter's face reddened as he recognized similar phrases he'd heard throughout his own career, used about others. Elijah went on, his voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of carefully controlled emotion. "Every flight, every landing, every decision had to be perfect, no margin for error. Other pilots could make mistakes. They were just learning, having a bad day. But us?" Elijah shook his head slightly. One mistake and it confirmed every bias they already held. The radio crackled again, and Elijah paused to acknowledge a routine check-in. His response was crisp and professional, then he continued. "Marcus retired early, not because he wanted to, but because the constant scrutiny, the extra checks, the subtle doubts, they wear you down, like waves against a cliff. Eventually, even the strongest stone shows cracks." Carter sat in silence, absorbing the weight of these words. His mind went back to the terminal, to his own actions just hours ago. He thought about how quickly he'd jumped to suspicion, How easily he'd dismissed Elijah's credentials. "The system trains you to watch us more closely," Elijah continued. "To grade us more harshly, to question our presence in spaces like this." He gestured to the cockpit around them. "And still we rise, we excel, we prove ourselves again and again, not because we should have to, but because we have to." The ocean below was invisible in the darkness, but Carter found himself staring down anyway, as if searching for answers in the black expanse. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "I didn't come here to be racist." Elijah's response came without hesitation, his voice carrying neither accusation nor absolution. "You didn't. You just showed up in a system that already was." The plane continued its steady course through the night sky, carrying its passengers toward dawn. The instrument panels glowed softly, casting their blue light over both men as they sat in contemplative silence, each processing the weight of truth spoken at 39,000 feet. Meanwhile, the morning sun crept over Atlanta's skyline, casting long shadows across the city's sleepy streets. In his bedroom, 16-year-old Marcus rolled over and grabbed his phone from the nightstand, squinting at the screen through bleary eyes. His notifications had exploded overnight. The video he'd captured at Gate B-22 had gone viral. Marcus sat up straight in bed, suddenly wide awake. The view count had skyrocketed past 3 million. His hands shook slightly as he scrolled through the thousands of comments, shares, and reactions pouring in from across the globe. The hashtags #Captain Moore and #Let Him Fly dominated trending lists on multiple platforms. "Mom!" he called out, his voice cracking with excitement. "Mom, you need to see this." Across town in the CNN newsroom, producers huddled around monitors displaying the viral footage. The morning news anchor, Lisa Martinez, adjusted her earpiece as the technical director counted down to their live segment. "Breaking this morning," Lisa began, her voice carrying the weight of significance. "A video showing a disturbing incident at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport has sparked a national conversation about discrimination in the aviation industry." The segment cut to interviews with former students of Captain Moore. Susan Jenkins, now a commercial pilot herself, spoke with tears in her eyes about how Elijah had mentored her through flight school. "He never complained," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "He just worked harder than anyone else and made sure to help others along the way." Retired Captain James Wilson, a 30-year veteran of the industry, appeared via video link from his home in Chicago. His white hair and weathered face spoke to decades of experience as he shared his own stories. "What happened to Captain Moore isn't new," he explained, his voice steady but sad. "It's just that now, finally, people are seeing it." Aviation diversity advocates seized the moment to share statistics that had long been overlooked. Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, director of the Aviation Equality Initiative, presented data showing that less than 2% of airline pilots were Black. "This isn't about one incident," she emphasized, pointing to a graph. "This is about systemic barriers that have existed for generations." The story spread across morning shows and news websites. But unlike many viral moments of racial tension, the public response wasn't primarily anger. Instead, a somber realization seemed to settle over viewers as they witnessed the quiet dignity with which Elijah had handled the situation. Comments flooded social media. "How many times has this happened without cameras rolling?" "The way he stayed professional through all of that? This is what everyday discrimination looks like, not always loud, but always there." In a glass-walled conference room high above downtown Atlanta, airline executives gathered for an emergency PR call. Coffee cups and laptops cluttered the long table as they connected with their crisis management team. CEO Richard Bennett's face appeared on the main screen, his expression grave. "We need a statement out within the hour," he declared, running a hand through his silver hair. "Something that acknowledges the severity while demonstrating our commitment to change." Carla Torres, the head of internal communications, nodded as she typed rapidly on her laptop. "We're drafting language now, sir. Should we include specific action items?" "Yes," Bennett replied firmly. "And get me Carter's personnel file immediately. We need to understand how this happened and ensure it never happens again." The PR team worked frantically, passing drafts back and forth as they crafted their response. Words like unacceptable, accountability, and systematic changes filled their screens. But their careful wordsmithing was suddenly interrupted by an alert from their social media monitoring system. A new post was going viral, this time from 39,000 feet above the Atlantic. A passenger in first class had managed to capture a photo through the partially open cockpit door. The image showed Captain Moore at the controls, his posture relaxed but alert, his hand steady on the yoke. Behind him sat Carter, his earlier hostility replaced by an expression of genuine attention as he watched Elijah work. The caption read simply, "That's the real lesson. Let him fly." The photo spread even faster than the original video. News anchors paused their coverage to share the update. Social media erupted with fresh comments, many noting the powerful contrast between the two images, the confrontation at the gate and this moment of quiet learning. In the conference room, the executives stared at the new image displayed on their screen. Carla Torres slowly closed her laptop. "I think," she said softly, "this might be more powerful than any statement we could write." The CEO leaned back in his chair, studying the photo. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly as he nodded. "Sometimes," he mused, "the best response is to let actions speak louder than words." Outside the conference room windows, the morning sun now sat high above Atlanta. At Hartsfield-Jackson, planes continued to take off and land, their paths cutting through the clear blue sky. The viral video played on phones and screens throughout the terminal, but its impact had evolved from outrage to something more profound, a mirror reflecting long-hidden truths about who we trust to guide us through the clouds. In newsrooms across the country, producers began shifting their coverage from the initial incident to broader discussions about representation in aviation. Industry veterans who had stayed quiet for years began sharing their stories. Flight schools reported sudden increases in inquiries from minority students. The conversation was changing, one view at a time. The morning wore on, and the photo from the cockpit continued to spread. Each share carried the same simple message: let him fly. 3 words that seemed to capture something essential about trust, respect, and the long journey toward true equality, not just in aviation but everywhere. The first hints of dawn painted the horizon in soft pinks and purples as their Boeing 787 cruised toward its final destination. Through the cockpit windows, the majestic Swiss Alps emerged from the darkness, their snow-capped peaks catching the early morning light. Zurich's distinctive skyline began to materialize in the distance, a welcome sight after the long transatlantic journey. Elijah's hands moved with practiced precision across the instrument panel as he initiated the descent procedures. His movements were fluid and confident, each action part of a well-rehearsed symphony he had performed countless times before. The navigation displays showed their approach path, and he began coordinating with Zurich air traffic control in his characteristic, calm, clear voice. Carter sat quietly in the jump seat, his body language markedly different from the rigid, suspicious posture he had displayed hours earlier at the gate in Atlanta. His shoulders had relaxed, and his eyes followed Elijah's movements with genuine interest rather than scrutiny. When Elijah reached for a switch on the overhead panel, Carter instinctively handed him the approach checklist, earning a small nod of appreciation from the captain. "Weather report shows light crosswinds," Elijah announced, making minor adjustments to their approach. "Visibility excellent." Carter leaned forward slightly, taking in the complex array of instruments and the methodical way Elijah monitored each one. Though he wasn't trained as a pilot, he found himself anticipating some of the basic procedures after watching Elijah work through the night. When Elijah needed a radio frequency changed, Carter was already reaching for the dial. The plane descended through layers of clouds, the massive aircraft responding to every subtle input from Elijah's steady hands. The city grew larger beneath them, its streets and buildings taking shape in the morning light. Carter watched in amazement as Elijah handled a sudden wind gust with a slight correction that passengers probably didn't even notice. As they made their final approach to Zurich International Airport, the landing gear deployed with a reassuring thud. The runway appeared ahead, and Elijah guided the aircraft down with the same grace he had demonstrated throughout the flight. The touchdown was so smooth that passengers might have missed the exact moment the wheels met the tarmac. Spontaneous applause erupted from the cabin. The sound filtered into the cockpit, accompanied by a few cheers and whistles. The flight attendants exchanged knowing looks, some discreetly wiping at their eyes. They had all witnessed the confrontation in Atlanta, and this moment felt like more than just appreciation for a smooth landing. Elijah reached for the intercom switch, his expression thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice carried the same professional warmth it always did, but there was an added layer of meaning that wasn't lost on anyone who had seen the video or witnessed the earlier events. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Thank you for your patience today during our unexpected delay in Atlanta. We hope you saw the best of us, even under the worst of assumptions. Welcome to Zurich, where the local time is 6:45 a.m. The temperature is a pleasant 18 degrees Celsius, or 64 degrees Fahrenheit. In the cabin, several passengers reached for their phones, recording the landing announcement. A woman in business class dabbed at her eyes with a napkin while her seatmate nodded appreciatively. The flight attendants stood in the aisles, their usual professional smiles carrying extra warmth. Elijah guided the aircraft to its gate with the same precise control he had demonstrated throughout the flight. As the engine spun down and the seatbelt sign chimed off, passengers began gathering their belongings. The cabin filled with the usual sounds of overhead bins opening and quiet conversations, but there was something different in the air, a sense of having witnessed something important. While passengers filed out of the aircraft, Carter remained in the jump seat, watching as Elijah began the post-flight procedures. The cockpit felt different now, the earlier tension replaced by something more contemplative. Elijah moved through his shutdown checklist with the same methodical care he had shown all night, powering down systems and logging final readings. Carter's hands fidgeted slightly in his lap as he watched the last passengers leaving through the cabin windows. His face showed the internal struggle of someone coming to terms with difficult realizations. Finally, he took a deep breath and reached for something he had been avoiding eye contact with all night: the cabin intercom handset. His hand trembled slightly as he picked it up. Elijah paused in his shutdown procedure, turning slightly to observe but saying nothing. Carter's finger hovered over the broadcast button for a moment before pressing it firmly. When he spoke, his voice shook with emotion, but his words came out clear and deliberate. The cabin crew froze in place, their eyes widening as they heard Carter's voice come over the speakers. The remaining passengers in the jet bridge slowed their pace, turning back toward the aircraft as the unexpected announcement began. Through the cockpit windows, the rising sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, as if nature itself was waiting to hear what would come next. Carter's voice trembled slightly over the intercom, but his words carried clearly through the cabin. "I want to say something." He paused, taking a deep breath that was audible through the speakers. "I didn't think Captain Moore was the pilot. I didn't ask, I assumed, and I was wrong." Passengers who had been shuffling toward the exits stopped mid-stride. A businessman lowered his briefcase. A mother held her child closer. The flight attendants stood perfectly still in the aisles, their professional smiles softening into something more genuine. In the cockpit, Elijah's hands stilled over the instrument panel. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly as Carter continued speaking. "Captain Moore saved this flight tonight, and I was privileged to witness what professionalism and grace look like." Carter's voice grew stronger with each word, as if the weight of truth was lifting something heavy from his chest. "I saw things I never understood before, things I never wanted to understand before." The cabin remained silent for several heartbeats after the intercom clicked off. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the plane, a single person began to clap. The sound echoed lonely at first, then others joined in. A wave of applause built from row to row, growing into something more than just polite acknowledgement. Someone called out, "Thank you." Others joined in with words of support. The applause swelled, filling the cabin with an emotion that transcended the usual end-of-flight relief. This was something different: recognition of human dignity, of wrongs acknowledged, of small steps toward change. Carter stepped out of the cockpit, his uniform crisp but his composure barely holding. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he blinked rapidly against tears that threatened to fall. The nearest passengers reached out to shake his hand or pat his shoulder as he passed. An elderly woman squeezed his arm and whispered, "Good man." Outside the aircraft, the early morning sun streamed through the terminal windows, casting long shadows across the gate area. A small group of Swiss journalists had gathered, their cameras ready and notebooks open. Word of the viral video had spread across the Atlantic faster than the flight itself, and local media had caught wind of the story's significance. Among the waiting crowd stood a mother and her young son, set apart from the journalists by their earnest anticipation. The boy, no more than 7 or 8, wore a carefully assembled outfit, dark pants, a white shirt, and what appeared to be handmade pilot's wings pinned to his chest. His mother held his hand with one of hers. In the other, she gripped a homemade sign that read, "Danke, Captain Moore," in careful, colorful letters. The boy bounced on his toes, his eyes fixed on the aircraft door. His mother spoke to him softly in Swiss German, smoothing his hair with gentle fingers. The gesture seemed to contain all the hope and worry of parents who want their children's dreams to fly free of the barriers they themselves had faced. As passengers began deplaning, many paused to take in the scene at the gate. Some recognized the gathering of journalists and pulled out their phones, understanding they were witnessing the conclusion of something that had begun with another camera in Atlanta. Carter emerged first, his steps hesitant as he saw the crowd. A few cameras turned his way, but he quickly stepped aside, making himself small against the wall. His posture spoke of someone who understood this moment wasn't about him, or rather wasn't about who he had been 8 hours ago. Then Elijah appeared in the doorway. He moved with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through the night, his uniform still perfectly pressed despite the long flight. The cameras began clicking rapidly, but his expression remained composed, not stern but peacefully resolute. The young boy couldn't contain himself any longer. He tugged free from his mother's hand and ran forward, his makeshift pilot's costume fluttering. In his small hands, he clutched a notebook that seemed too big for him. "Captain, Captain!" he called out in accented English. Elijah's face softened as he saw the boy approaching. Without hesitation, he knelt down to meet the child at eye level, his movements deliberate and gentle. The boy thrust the notebook forward, his eyes wide with admiration. "Will you sign, please?" the boy asked, his English careful and practiced. Elijah took the notebook with the same respect he would show to any flight document. He pulled a pen from his breast pocket, the same one he'd used to sign off on countless pre-flight checklists throughout the night. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Marco," the boy replied, standing as straight as he could in his homemade uniform. Camera flashes burst around them, but neither seemed to notice. This moment existed in its own bubble of understanding between an experienced pilot and a child who dared to dream of following the same path. Elijah signed the notebook with careful strokes, then looked directly into Marco's eyes. "You'll fly higher than me someday," he said quietly. His words meant only for the boy, but carrying enough weight to silence the clicking cameras. Marco's face lit up with pure joy, clutching the notebook to his chest as if it contained all the possibilities of his future. The photographers captured this moment, not the confrontation they might have expected, but something far more powerful. Their lenses caught the gentle smile of a captain who had navigated not just through turbulent skies, but through the storms of prejudice with unwavering grace. They captured the wonder in a child's eyes, untouched by the biases that had tried to ground other dreams. They captured the quiet victory of dignity over discrimination, of professionalism over prejudice. The mother stepped forward, tears streaming freely down her face as she held up their sign. "Danke," she whispered, the word carrying years of her own hopes and fears for her son's future. The cameras continued to flash, recording not scandal but triumph, not conflict but connection. In their viewfinders, they framed a moment when the sky seemed a little more open, a little more free, for everyone who dared to look up and dream of flying. The morning sun filtered through Zurich Airport's vast windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Elijah walked with measured steps through the terminal, his posture straight and professional despite the exhaustion of the overnight flight. 2 local airline officials flanked him, their Swiss Air uniforms pristine, occasionally gesturing and speaking in hushed, respectful tones. A few steps behind, Carter followed like a shadow, his earlier confidence replaced by a contemplative silence. His uniform, though still neat, seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders. Every few steps, someone would glance their way, recognition flickering across their faces. The video had spread faster than anyone expected. The small procession made its way past duty-free shops and bustling cafes. Though the initial crowd of journalists and onlookers had dispersed, their passage still drew attention. Travelers paused mid-conversation. Phones appeared discreetly to capture photos, and whispers followed in their wake. The air itself seemed charged with the lingering energy of what had transpired. One of the Swiss officials gestured toward a quiet corridor leading to the airline's private offices. "This way, Captain Moore. We've arranged a comfortable space for you to rest and refresh before your return flight." Elijah nodded, maintaining his characteristic composure. The click of their shoes against the floor echoed in the relative quiet of the administrative wing. Carter's footsteps behind them seemed to grow increasingly hesitant, as if each step required conscious effort. As they approached the office area, a flight attendant emerged from a side hallway. Her name tag identified her as Maria, and her eyes held a mix of determination and emotion as she approached the group. She spoke quietly to one of the officials, who nodded and stepped aside, allowing her a moment with Elijah. "Captain Moore," she began, her voice steady but soft. "May I speak with you privately?" Elijah gestured to a nearby alcove away from the others. Maria's professional demeanor softened slightly as she gathered her thoughts. "My father was a pilot," she said, her accent carrying hints of both Swiss German and Caribbean cadence. "He flew for 20 years, always as co-pilot. Never made captain, despite perfect records, despite more hours than anyone else in his fleet." She paused, swallowing hard. "He was from Trinidad. Like you, he heard all the excuses. Not enough experience, not the right fit, not ready for command." Elijah listened intently, his eyes showing understanding that went beyond words. Maria continued, her voice growing stronger. "He retired last year, never got his 4th stripe. But this morning, when I saw you in that cockpit, when I heard what happened..." She took a deep breath. "You're making it a little easier for those coming behind you. For people like my father, like me, like that little boy with his sign. Thank you." Elijah reached out and squeezed her shoulder gently. No words were needed. The gesture carried decades of shared understanding. Meanwhile, Carter had drifted toward the airport cafe, seeking a moment of anonymity. The attempt proved futile. Above the coffee bar, a wall-mounted television displayed a news broadcast, the sound muted but the images clear. Carter watched as his own face appeared on screen, footage from the viral video showing his confrontation with Elijah at the gate in Atlanta. The caption below read, "Ground Marshal apologizes mid-flight." The screen split to show social media reactions, comments scrolling past too quickly to read, but the hashtags were clear. Number Captain Moore, number Let Him Fly, number Change Takes Humility. Other travelers in the cafe cast uncertain glances his way. A woman at the next table pulled her purse closer. A businessman in a suit looked from the screen to Carter and back again, his expression unreadable. Carter lowered his head, studying the untouched coffee growing cold before him. The broadcast continued silently above, showing clips from the arrival. The young boy in his makeshift uniform, Elijah kneeling to sign the notebook, the mother with her handmade sign. Each image seemed to carry more weight than the last. Back in the administrative wing, Elijah's phone buzzed with an incoming message. The airline's corporate headquarters had been busy during the flight. The message was carefully worded, clearly crafted by a team of PR professionals. "In recognition of exceptional service and recent events, we are pleased to offer Captain Moore 1 week of paid administrative leave for rest and recovery. A personal media liaison will be assigned to assist with press inquiries and public appearances. Please advise on your preferred schedule for interviews." Elijah read the message twice, his expression unchanging. Rain had begun to fall outside, drops creating intricate patterns on the window glass. He watched them trace their paths downward as he composed his reply, fingers tapping out a response that reflected the same dignity he'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. "Not interested in press, just let me fly." He stood at the window, watching the rain intensify. Behind him, the officials waited respectfully, their tablets displaying the growing media coverage. The story had spread across continents now, But Elijah's attention remained on the rain-streaked glass on the distant runways where aircraft continued their eternal dance of takeoffs and landings. Through the reflection in the window, he could see Carter still sitting in the cafe, shoulders hunched, facing his own kind of turbulence. The rain continued to dot the glass, each drop carrying its own small reflection of the world beyond, a world that perhaps was shifting ever so slightly toward something better. The evening settled over Zurich like a soft blanket, the city's lights twinkling against the backdrop of lingering rain clouds. Elijah made his way through the quiet lobby of a modest business hotel. His rolling suitcase's wheels whispered against the carpeted floor. The day's events had left an invisible weight on his shoulders, though his posture remained characteristically straight. The hotel room was simple but comfortable, clean lines, neutral colors, and a large window overlooking the city's medieval spires. Elijah went through his post-flight routine with practiced precision, each movement deliberate despite his exhaustion. He removed his uniform carefully, pressing out any wrinkles before laying it neatly across the back of a wooden chair. The 4 stripes on the sleeve caught the warm lamplight, gleaming softly. The room service menu sat on the desk, its pages slightly worn at the corners. Elijah picked it up, scanning the offerings without really seeing them at first. His mind wandered back to Atlanta, to the gate, to the long flight across the Atlantic. Finally focusing, he picked up the room phone and ordered a simple meal: grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, and a pot of chamomile tea. While waiting for his dinner, Elijah performed his usual hotel room checks, adjusting the temperature, testing the shower's water pressure, ensuring the alarm clock was set correctly. These small rituals helped ground him, bringing order to the chaos of the day's events. When the food arrived, he thanked the server quietly and carried the tray to the small table by the window. The city spread out before him, its ancient architecture blending seamlessly with modern buildings. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, creating a peaceful atmosphere that seemed worlds away from the tension of the past 24 hours. After eating just enough to satisfy his hunger, Elijah finally allowed himself to sink into the bed. The mattress welcomed him, cradling his tired body. He closed his eyes, listening to the soft patter of rain against the window and the distant hum of the city below. Just as his muscles began to relax, a gentle knock at the door pulled him back to alertness. Years of training kicked in. Even exhausted, his movements were precise as he rose to answer it. A young man in a courier's uniform stood in the hallway, holding a sealed manila envelope. "Special delivery for Captain Moore," he said, his Swiss accent careful around the English words. "Signature required, please." Elijah signed the electronic pad and accepted the envelope. It felt light in his hands, but somehow carried a weight beyond its physical presence. The return address was simply marked Carter, written in hurried but clear handwriting. Back inside the room, Elijah sat on the edge of the bed, studying the envelope for a moment before carefully breaking the seal. Inside, he found 2 items: a handwritten note on hotel stationery and a printed photograph. He unfolded the note first, the paper crisp between his fingers. Carter's words flowed across the page in neat, deliberate strokes. "I never imagined a black man in your seat, but I'm thankful now I have. I'm staying in this job, not to guard gates, but to open them. Jump seat, 39K feet, still learning." The simplicity of the message carried more weight than 1,000 apologies could have. Elijah read it twice, letting the words sink in. Then he turned his attention to the photograph. The image captured a moment from their flight that Elijah hadn't been aware of. Someone, perhaps a crew member, had taken it without his knowledge. In the photo, Elijah sat at the controls, his profile illuminated by the soft glow of instrument panels and starlight. His expression showed complete focus and calm competence, hands resting naturally on the controls. Behind him, Carter sat in the jump seat, his face a study in contemplation. The photo had caught him in a moment of deep thought, his earlier rigid posture replaced by something more open, more questioning. The contrast between the 2 men told its own story, one of authority earned through years of excellence, the other of assumptions being quietly dismantled at 39,000 feet. Elijah reached for his flight bag, pulling out his well-worn logbook. The leather cover was soft from years of handling, the pages filled with careful notations of countless flights. Tucked into the front pocket was a photograph of his daughter, her smile bright and confident in her college graduation cap and gown. With careful movements, he placed Carter's note alongside his daughter's photo. The juxtaposition struck him, his daughter's future and Carter's awakening, both representing different kinds of progress, different kinds of hope. A faint smile crossed Elijah's face, the first genuine one since the flight began. It wasn't a smile of triumph or vindication, but something quieter, an acknowledgement that sometimes change comes not in grand gestures, but in small moments of understanding at 39,000 feet. Outside the hotel window, Zurich lay peaceful under its gray evening sky. The ancient city had seen centuries of change, of barriers broken and minds opened. Now it witnessed another small step forward, marked by a note in a pilot's logbook and a photograph of two men in a cockpit. Elijah closed his eyes in silence, letting the quiet of the room envelop him. The rain continued its gentle rhythm against the window, a soft lullaby for a day that had started with confrontation and ended with the possibility of change. 3 days later, the familiar bustle of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport welcomed Elijah home. The terminal's fluorescent lights cast their usual sterile glow as he made his way through customs, his pilot's uniform still crisp despite the long flight. His rolling suitcase's wheels clicked rhythmically against the polished floor as he headed toward the employee shuttle area. The airport felt different somehow, not in its physical appearance. The same signs still hung overhead, the same announcements still echoed through the corridors, but in the way people looked at him. Staff members who passed by offered respectful nods, their eyes holding recognition, where before there might have been indifference. Near the shuttle stop, Mr. Johnson, the elderly janitor who'd been working at the airport for over 2 decades, spotted Elijah. With a broad smile, he raised his hand in an exaggerated military salute, his eyes twinkling with warmth and humor. Elijah couldn't help but return the gesture with a genuine grin, appreciating the lightness of the moment. "Welcome back, Captain," Mr. Johnson called out, leaning on his mop handle. "Saw you made quite an impression while you were gone." Elijah adjusted his captain's hat and gave a modest shrug. "Just doing my job, Mr. Johnson. Same as you." "Ain't nothing just about what either of us do," the older man replied with a knowing look. "You keep flying high, Captain." The employee shuttle arrived right on schedule, its doors hissing open. Elijah boarded, nodding thanks to the driver who greeted him by name, something that hadn't happened before. The short ride to the crew facilities was quiet, giving him time to decompress from the long flight. When he reached the crew lounge, Elijah expected the usual scene. Pilots and flight attendants catching quick naps between flights, others hunched over tablets reviewing flight plans, all of them wrapped in their own worlds. Instead, he found himself walking into something entirely different. A small group of flight trainees stood near the coffee station, their uniforms still showing the telltale stiffness of new fabric. There were 6 of them, 3 women and 3 men, representing a diversity that would have been unthinkable when Elijah first started flying. They straightened up as he entered, their conversations falling silent. One of the trainees, a young woman with close-cropped hair and determined eyes, stepped forward. Her hands fidgeted slightly with the sleeve of her uniform, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Captain Moore," she said, managing to sound both professional and awestruck. We all saw the video. We just wanted to say thank you." She glanced back at her colleagues, who nodded in encouragement. "You made us believe we belong here." Elijah took in their faces, eager, hopeful, carrying the same dreams he'd held when he first stepped into a cockpit. He saw in them the same fire, the same determination to prove themselves in an industry that hadn't always welcomed people who looked like them. He didn't need many words. Sometimes the simplest truths carried the most weight. "Fly right," he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of 15 years in the sky. "Fly steady." The trainees absorbed his words like a mantra, their postures straightening almost unconsciously. One of them, a young man with features that suggested South Asian heritage, spoke up. "Sir, we've started a study group. We meet 3 times a week to review procedures and support each other through training. Would you maybe consider stopping by sometime?" Before Elijah could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He held up one finger, asking for a moment as he checked the notification. It was an internal airline memo, marked as priority. His eyes scanned the contents quickly, and something in his expression must have changed because the trainees leaned forward slightly, curious. The memo was brief but significant. Carter had formally requested a transfer to the Airline Diversity Recruitment Division. Below that information was a line that made Elijah pause. Carter's name was now listed as a key coordinator for an upcoming initiative titled Widening the Skies. Elijah looked up from his phone to find the trainees still watching him expectantly. In their faces, he saw the future of aviation, a future that might just be a little more open, a little more fair than the one he'd faced. The weight of the memo in his pocket felt like a small victory, not just for him, but for everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong in the cockpit. The young woman who'd spoken first was still waiting for his answer about the study group. In her eyes, Elijah saw the same determination he'd carried through his own training years, the same need to prove herself worthy of the sky. He saw the same fire that had kept him going through every checkpoint, every suspicious glance, every subtle dismissal. The crew lounge's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their steady glow over the scene. Outside the windows, planes continued their eternal dance of takeoffs and landings, their lights piercing the Georgia sky. The familiar sounds of the airport, announcements, distant jet engines, rolling luggage, created a backdrop to this moment of quiet significance. In this space, surrounded by the next generation of aviators who saw in him a path forward, Elijah felt the weight of both progress made and progress yet to come. The video that had captured his confrontation with Carter had done more than go viral. It had opened a door, sparked conversations, and maybe, just maybe, helped change the course of a few lives. The memo about Carter's transfer sat in his phone like a quiet affirmation that sometimes change was possible. That sometimes a single flight across the Atlantic could bridge more than just physical distance. That sometimes the sky really was the limit, not just for some, but for everyone who dared to reach for it. Later that week, the familiar rhythm of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport pulsed through its terminals as Elijah Moore went through his pre-flight routine. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his captain's stripes gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The weight of his flight bag felt comfortable on his shoulder as he made his way toward the gate, his logbook tucked securely inside. This time, as he approached Gate B-22, the same gate where everything had changed just days ago, the atmosphere was noticeably different. No tension hung in the air. No suspicious glances followed his movements. Instead, a young gate marshal, barely in his 20s, straightened up as Elijah approached. "Good morning, Captain Moore," the marshal said, his voice carrying genuine respect. "We've heard a lot about you, sir." His eyes sparkled with admiration as he gestured toward the jet bridge. Elijah nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The marshal efficiently checked his credentials, a standard procedure now performed with professional courtesy rather than suspicion. The process took mere seconds, exactly as it should. As he walked down the jet bridge, Elijah could hear the familiar sounds of pre-boarding preparations, the hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit, the clatter of catering carts, the muffled voices of the ground crew. These sounds had been the soundtrack to his career for 15 years, but today they seemed to carry a different note. One of progress, however small. Stepping into the aircraft, Elijah was greeted by the cabin crew with their usual warmth, though now there was an added layer of respect in their eyes. He made his way to the cockpit, his steps measured and confident. As he entered, he found someone already there, a young black woman in a crisp first officer's uniform, running through the pre-flight checklist with methodical precision. She looked up as he entered, and her face broke into a bright smile. Despite her professional demeanor, there was an unmistakable excitement in her eyes, the kind that came from achieving a long-held dream. "Captain Moore," she said, standing to greet him. "First Officer Harper Bennett, it's an honor to fly with you today." Elijah set his flight bag down and extended his hand. "Welcome aboard, First Officer Bennett. How long have you been with the airline?" Harper's posture remained professional, but her voice carried a hint of emotion as she replied, "Just completed training last month, sir, but I've been dreaming of this seat since I was 10. She ran her hand along the edge of the control panel with reverence. Elijah watched her familiar gesture. He'd done the same thing countless times in his early days. "Then make it your own," he said warmly. "This is where you belong." Through the cockpit window, they could see the bustling terminal. Near the main concourse, a new recruiting banner hung prominently, its colors bright against the terminal's neutral walls. The banner showed diverse faces in airline uniforms with bold text promoting aviation careers. Standing beside it was Carter, looking different in a well-fitted suit rather than his marshal's uniform. He was speaking animatedly to two high school students, gesturing toward various parts of the terminal as he led them on what appeared to be a tour. His body language was open and engaging, a far cry from the rigid stance he'd held just days ago. As if sensing their gaze, Carter looked up toward the aircraft. His eyes met Elijah's through the cockpit window. For a moment, they held each other's gaze. Then Carter gave a small, deliberate nod, not one of mere acknowledgement, but of understanding, of respect, of change in progress. Elijah returned the gesture, equally measured. Harper had already begun the pre-flight checks, her movements confident and precise. Elijah settled into his captain's seat, feeling the familiar embrace of the controls under his hands. The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Ground crew signals indicated they were ready for pushback. The engines hummed to life under their careful preparation. Harper's voice was clear and professional as she communicated with the tower. Everything moved with the precision of a well-orchestrated dance. As they taxied toward the runway, the first rays of sunrise broke through the clouds. The aircraft aligned perfectly with the runway centerline, ready for takeoff. Elijah's hands rested on the controls with the calm certainty that came from thousands of hours in the air. The tower gave them clearance. The engines roared with building power. The aircraft began its roll down the runway, gathering speed with graceful determination. As they lifted off, the clouds parted before them, revealing a vast, clear sky that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. Beside him, Harper handled her duties with quiet competence. Below them, Atlanta grew smaller, the airport where so much had changed, becoming just another collection of buildings and runways. But up here, in the realm where Elijah had always felt most at home, everything was exactly as it should be. No speeches were needed. No headlines would mark this flight. This was simply a captain and his first officer doing what they were trained to do, flying steady and true through the morning sky. Elijah's fingers rested lightly on the controls, his presence in the cockpit a quiet but powerful testament to progress. The sky ahead was clear and boundless, stretching out before them like an open invitation. In the cockpit of this aircraft, 15 years of experience met fresh enthusiasm, creating a perfect balance of wisdom and promise. This was what moving forward looked like, not with fanfare or proclamations, but with quiet dignity and unwavering pride. As they climbed to their cruising altitude, the sun continued its ascent alongside them, casting long rays through the cockpit windows. Elijah and Harper worked in comfortable synchronization, their focus entirely on the task at hand. This was their domain now, a shared space where both of them had earned their right to be, where both of them belonged. 1 week later, sunlight filtered through the high windows of a modest auditorium at the Atlanta Aviation Academy. The space buzzed with quiet energy as students filtered in, their excited whispers echoing off the walls. Handmade banners declaring First Flight Career Day for aspiring pilots hung from the rafters, their letters carefully painted in bold blues and whites. Elijah Moore sat in the back row, dressed in jeans and a casual button-down shirt, a stark contrast to his usual crisp uniform. Without his captain's stripes, he blended easily into the crowd of parents and mentors who had come to support the young dreamers. His presence was intentionally low-key. This wasn't his show. The auditorium filled steadily with students of all backgrounds. Some wore aviation-themed t-shirts, others clutched notebooks covered in airplane stickers. A group of teenage girls huddled together, discussing flight patterns they'd learned in ground school. Near the front, a young boy in a wheelchair studied a model aircraft with intense concentration. The morning light caught dust motes dancing in the air as the last few attendees found their seats. The room hummed with potential. Dozens of young people, each carrying their own sky-high dreams. Elijah observed them all quietly, his arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. He recognized that look of determination in their eyes. He'd worn it himself for 15 years. Carter appeared at the podium, looking different from the rigid marshal who had stood in Elijah's way just days ago. He wore a simple suit, his posture more relaxed but still professional. Gone was the defensive stance, replaced by something more open, more genuine. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and began to speak. "Good morning," Carter said, his voice steady and clear. "I'm not here to talk about viral videos or social media moments. I'm here to tell you about excellence, about dedication, about what it means to show up every day, year after year, and prove yourself through actions rather than words." The students settled in their seats, attention caught by his directness. Carter didn't mention his own role in recent events. Instead, he began to tell a story, Elijah's story, but not the one that had made headlines. 15 years ago, a pilot began his journey, Carter continued. He didn't ask for special treatment. He didn't demand attention. He simply showed up every day and flew with precision that went beyond excellence. He logged extra hours, he studied harder. He faced challenges with a quiet dignity that some of us are only beginning to understand. From his seat in the back, Elijah remained still, his expression unchanged. This wasn't about him, not really. It was about something larger, something growing in the cracks of an old system. Carter spoke about pre-dawn flights and midnight landings, about weather challenges and technical expertise. He detailed the years of constant proving and reproving, the weight of unspoken expectations, the burden of being both exceptional and invisible at the same time. The students leaned forward in their seats, caught up in the narrative. A young girl with braids scribbled furiously in her notebook. Two boys in the middle row exchanged knowing glances, their own dreams reflecting in their eyes. "This isn't just about flying planes," Carter explained, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "It's about persistence, about maintaining your course when headwinds try to push you off track, about knowing your worth even when others question it." He spoke about emergency landings handled with calm precision, about thousands of passengers carried safely through storms, about a career built on quiet competence rather than loud declarations. The students absorbed every word, their faces showing a mix of inspiration and determination. In the back row, Elijah uncrossed his arms and leaned forward slightly. He wasn't here for recognition. His presence was about witnessing something else, the slow but steady turning of a tide. Each young face in that room represented a possible future, a chance for aviation to become what it always should have been, a sky open to everyone with the skill and dedication to fly. Carter's voice grew stronger as he continued. Every time this pilot took to the sky, he wasn't just flying a plane. He was opening a path, creating possibilities, proving that excellence knows no color, that skill has no gender, that the sky belongs to anyone brave enough to reach for it. The students sat transfixed. A teenager in a wheelchair gripped his armrests tightly, his eyes shining with possibility. A girl wearing a hijab nodded slowly, recognition dawning in her expression. These weren't just words they were hearing. They were permissions they'd been waiting for, confirmations they'd been seeking. As Carter concluded his speech, the room remained hushed for a moment before erupting into applause. Students began standing, their enthusiasm infectious. Some wiped tears from their eyes, others exchanged determined looks with their friends. Carter stepped away from the podium, his own composure slightly shaken by the response. As he walked toward the exit, he caught sight of Elijah standing quietly by the door. Their eyes met across the space that separated them, a space that seemed smaller now than it had been a week ago. They didn't move to shake hands. No grand gestures were needed. Instead, they shared something quieter but more meaningful, a nod of mutual understanding, of acknowledgement, of respect earned rather than demanded. "I've still got a lot to learn," Carter said softly, his words meant only for Elijah's ears. Elijah's response came with the same quiet certainty that had carried him through 15 years in the sky. "Then you're on the right path." Outside the auditorium, students began lining up excitedly for their turns in the cockpit simulators. Each wore a small pin that caught the morning light. Let him fly. But these weren't just words on a pin anymore. They were a promise, a commitment, a future taking shape in real time. The autumn breeze carried the familiar scent of jet fuel and crisp leaves across the small park near Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Elijah Moore sat on a weathered wooden bench, his pressed uniform standing out against the casual backdrop of the recreational area. Above him, planes carved white trails through the crystal-clear Georgia sky, their paths intersecting like celestial roads. Between flights, these quiet moments had become his sanctuary. The bench, positioned perfectly under a spreading oak tree, offered both shade and an unobstructed view of the takeoff patterns. His flight bag rested beside him, the leather worn smooth from years of faithful service. With practiced care, Elijah reached into his bag and withdrew his logbook. The notebook's cover had softened with age, its corners gently rounded from countless openings and closings. Unlike the sterile digital logs that most pilots now kept, this one held more than just flight hours and technical notes. He opened it slowly, letting the pages fall naturally to reveal 3 treasured items. The first was a photograph of his daughter, caught mid-laugh at her high school graduation. Her eyes sparkled with the same determination he saw in the mirror each morning. The picture's edges had softened from frequent handling, but the joy in her expression remained undimmed. Next to it lay Carter's letter, the paper now showing gentle creases where it had been folded and unfolded many times. The handwriting remained clear. "I never imagined a black man in your seat, but I'm thankful now I have. I'm staying in this job not to guard gates but to open them. Jump seat, 39K feet, still learning." The words carried more weight now than they had months ago, transformed from an apology into a promise kept. The third item made the corners of his mouth twitch upward slightly. A crayon drawing, carefully folded, showed a stick figure in a pilot's uniform standing beside an impossibly large airplane. The title, written in a child's unsteady hand, proclaimed, "Captain Sky Hero" in bright blue letters. The young artist in Zurich had captured something beyond the uniform and the aircraft. There was a dignity in the simple drawing that spoke volumes. Above him, a Boeing 787 began its climb into the morning sky, its engines humming a familiar song. Elijah watched it rise, tracking its ascent with the practiced eye of someone who had made that same journey countless times. The sun caught the aircraft's wings, making them gleam like polished silver. His phone buzzed against his leg, interrupting his contemplation. Elijah retrieved it, noting the airline's executive office number in the sender field. The email's subject line read, "Pilot Mentorship Program, Leadership Request." Opening the message, he read through the carefully worded proposal. The airline wanted to establish a comprehensive mentorship program for underrepresented pilots, focusing on support and development from training through command qualification. They wanted him to co-lead the initiative. Elijah set the phone down on the bench beside him, his expression remaining neutral. He didn't smile. Instead, he took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs completely before releasing it slowly. The weight of the request settled around him like a familiar jacket. In the distance, one of the newer Airbus models began its takeoff roll. Elijah watched as it accelerated down the runway, its sleek form embodying all the advances in modern aviation. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, climbing with graceful precision into the morning sky. Its ascent was clean, steady, purposeful, everything a takeoff should be. The plane's path traced a perfect arc through the blue, representing not just technological progress, but the possibility of other kinds of advancement. Each new aircraft that took to the skies carried with it the potential for change, for opening doors that had long been closed. Standing up, Elijah gathered his belongings with practiced efficiency. He tucked the logbook back into his flight bag, each movement deliberate and precise. The weight of the bag felt right in his hand, a constant companion through years of service and change. As he began walking toward the shuttle stop, a young black girl playing near the park's edge spotted him. Her eyes widened with recognition, and she tugged excitedly at her mother's sleeve. "That's the captain from the story," she exclaimed, her voice carrying clearly across the morning air. Elijah turned slightly, offering her a small wave. Nothing grand or showy, just a quiet acknowledgement. The girl beamed back, clutching her mother's hand tightly, her face glowing with possibility. Moving toward the terminal, Elijah's steady stride carried him forward, while behind him, aircraft continued their eternal dance through the sky. Jets crisscrossed overhead, their contrails weaving patterns against the blue canvas. But now, each one of those planes represented something more than just a flight number or a destination. Each cockpit held a seat that could belong to someone who had never before imagined themselves there. Someone who just needed to be shown that the sky was open to them too. The shuttle stop stood ahead, its simple shelter catching the morning light. Around it, airport employees waited for their rides, some in maintenance uniforms, others in flight crew attire. A few nodded to Elijah as he approached, quiet respect in their gestures. Above them all, the planes continued their steady procession into the endless blue, each one carrying not just passengers, but possibilities. If you enjoyed the story of Elijah, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. If you enjoyed the story of Elijah, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.